So this concludes all of our styles using the techniques we learned for box model and box aesthetics. Next, we're going to develop our page layout by using the float positioning techniques that we learned in the previous examples. If we come back to the browser here, you can see that certain sections are going to take up the full width of the wrapper, and other sections will be columns that will be positioned side by side. So for example, here on the About page, which is our home page here, this About section is going to take up all 3 columns or all of the wrapper space. Okay, now this artist section here that has our video in it, the artist corner section, is going to take up only the first 2 columns on the left, and then the company news section is going to take up just a single right column here that will float beside it. And in other situations, like on the catalog page, we're going to have a 3-column structure where the men's section here is going to be a small box that takes up just the first column on the left. The women's section will take up the middle or the central column in the middle here, and the children's section will take up a single column to the right. So we'll have 1, 2, 3 boxes side by side. Okay, so in order to accomplish this, I'm going to make use of float positioning, and I'm going to go ahead and create sort of my own grid system to do this by creating classes. And each class will control whether that section is the width of a single column, 2 columns, or stretching across all 3 columns. And we'll also use float positioning to control whether it stays to the left or stays to the right. Okay, so I'm going to name each of these classes in a way that will make sense to me later on down the road, so I know how to apply these classes depending on how I'd like to position these sections on the page. So certain sections will only take up a single column. If we imagine that at most we'll have a 3-column structure, then I'm going to name classes col, C-O-L, for column, and then the number 1 if they only stretch across a single column. I'm going to use col2 or COL2 if they stretch across 2 columns, and col3 if they stretch across all 3 columns, such as in this intro pick section here, or rather the About section here, which stretches across all 3. Okay. So let's go ahead and create some classes. Let's create one here called column1 because it only stretches across a single column, and we'll say _left. So we know that this column positions to the left. And in order to position it to the left, we'll use float left, and we'll specify a specific width so that it takes up only 1 column. Okay, so if there's 3 columns, 33.3% should get me to the point where it's only about 1/3, because 3 of these would add up to like 99.999 and have 3 equal columns. However, we want to have a little bit of space in between the columns using margin. So we're going to use a calculator to figure out how wide these things need to be. So you can probably do this math in your head, but I'm not so great, not so hot at math, so I'm going to make sure that all this is correct using calculator. So we have 100% width of the wrapper available, and I want to have 1% of margin in between each of the 3 columns. So that would be 1% in between the left and middle column, and 1% margin in between the middle and right column. So each of those, 1% on the left side of the middle column and 1% on the right side of the middle column adds up to 2. So I have to subtract 2% from the 100, which gives me 98% leftover remaining available width to work with. So now I can take that 98% and divide it by 3 columns, and that'll give me 32.6. Okay, so this column should be 32.6% width. All right. And I think I'll also add a margin to it. We'll say that this guy has no margin on the top, no margin on the left and right, but he has 20 pixels of margin on the bottom, so that'll give a little bit of space. below each of the sections that I apply this to. Let's also create a single column for the middle. So this is the column that will float in the middle, and we'll set this also to float left, so it will stack up beside the other column that's floating to the left there, and that'll put it right in the middle. This guy will have the same width, which is 32.6%. Now one difference is I'm going to actually add margin on the left and right side of this guy by saying 0 on the top, 1% on the right, 20 pixels on the bottom, and 1% on the left. So remember, if you specify 4 values, the first value, if you go around clockwise, the first value is top, the second value is right, so this is 1% margin on the right. The next value going around clockwise is the bottom, 20 pixels on the bottom, and lastly 1% on the left. So this will give a percent of margin on each side of the middle column. Now the last column, which is on the right, is going to be pretty much the same as the left column, except for the fact that instead of floating left, we can float this guy to the right. Okay, but it'll have the same width and the same type of margin, which is no margin on the top, none on the left or right, and 20 pixels on the bottom. So this will be all the classes I need for my 3-column structure. Another situation is I might want an element to take up the width of 2 columns. So I'll go ahead and create a class called call2, meaning that it takes up the width of 2 columns. And we'll make, sometimes, the 2 column will be on the left side, and other times the 2 column will be on the right side. So we'll create 2 classes for that. Okay, so this guy obviously is going to float to the left, whereas the one on the right side is going to float to the right. Okay, we will have 100% available space, and then we'll have a column that's taking up the width of 2 columns, or excuse me, a section that's taking up the width of 2 columns, and then we'll have only 1% of margin on the right hand side of that, and then we'll have another column that's only taking up the width of 1 column. Okay, so instead of subtracting 2% margin, here we only have to subtract 1% margin, which gives us 99%, like that. Okay, so really what we want to do is we want to subtract the, also subtract the column on the right, because we know that for this guy, for column 2 left, we know that we're going to have the combination of a column 2 left and a column 1 right, which I should actually change the name of here. This will be column 1 left, column 1 mid, and column 1 right. So we're going to pair up like a column 2 left with a column 1 right, or a column 2 right with a column 1 left. And you'll see what I mean when we start implementing this into the page. So what I did was I decided to subtract the 32.6% to figure out what the remaining space is for this other column. So we have 99%, we took the 100% minus 1% margin, and then we're going to subtract 32.6, which will give me the width of the other column, which is 66.4%. Okay, so both of these guys should have a width of 66.4%. Okay, and this one here will have a margin of 0 on the top, 1% on the right, and then we'll say 20 pixels on the bottom and 0 on the left, like that. And this one will be the same here, except that it's floating right, and it'll be 0 margin on the top, 0 on the right, 20 pixels on the bottom, and 1% on the left. Okay, so I have more possibilities there. I can have a section taking up the width of a single column or taking up 2 columns. Okay, and then lastly, we may want to have something that spans all 3 columns, so we could just call that col3. So here we have a margin of 0, 0, 20 pixels, meaning 0 on the top, 0 on both sides, and just 20 pixels on the bottom. And we're going to add another class in here called column3 to make it take up all 3 columns. And remember, to add multiple classes, you can just put a space in between each class name. And now this has a class of column3, and it also has a class of shadow, so it should also have a drop shadow. So we'll go ahead and save that, and I will come back into the browser. And really the only thing it's going to change here is it's going to add some margin underneath it, which you can see it did there. Now there's a space in between this section and the next section, like that. And this is spanning 3 columns across. Okay, not too fancy there. Now things will start getting interesting down here. So this is the artist section, and I want the artist section to take up the width of 2 columns, or be 66.4% wide, and then have the news section, which is right here, company news, take up just the width of 1 column over here on the right hand side. So what I want to do is use the column 2 left for the artist's corner section, and I want to use column 1 right for the news section, right? So I can scroll down here to the artist corner, and we can go in here and add a class of column 2 underscore left, like that. And we'll come down to the news section, and we'll add a class of column 1 right, meaning it stays to the right, but it only has the width of 1 column. And we'll go ahead and save that, and we'll come back to our browser here, and we'll hit refresh, and there we go. So there's something kind of funny happening here. Company news is supposed to be able to fit next to this left-hand column, okay? But you guys might remember that there's 2 different box models, and this particular browser, Chrome, uses the W3C box model, where whenever I add like border or padding, in this case I have 20 pixels of padding around each of these, it actually makes it a little bit wider than will fit side by side. We also have some elements like the details section at the bottom of the page here that has contact, correspondence, links, and follow. It's pulling up beside the element that's floating. So that's kind of goofy too, so we'll have to fix that. So remember, in the one-off examples from the lecture, in the previous lecture slides, we looked at using a property called clear to get this guy to clear past. We also looked at changing the box model width to include padding using box dash sizing, a CSS3 property, to set all the browsers to use the same box model. Okay, so in order to get some of these things to work, we're going to have to go back into style.css, and I actually created a comment up near the top of the page here in a section called fixes right here. It's on line 12 of the style.css page. So we'll scroll up there, and let's go ahead and implement in some of these CSS fixes. One thing we want to do is change the box model. So we're going to say star to select all elements, like that. And we'll go ahead and tell, by default initially, we'll say these guys should have a margin of 0, padding of 0, and border of 0, just to do a reset. And then we'll also change the box sizing, which will make it so that when we specify a width, it will include the padding and the border. And we'll say use the value border box, which is the Internet Explorer box sizing method. Okay, and we'll use the prefixes WebKit also to make this work in old versions of Chrome and Safari. We'll say WebKit dash box dash sizing, and we'll say border dash box, and we'll also use dash MOZ dash box dash sizing. and we'll also set that to border dash box. Okay. So all elements now should be using the Internet Explorer border box method, which should give us good support in all the browsers and should allow these things to display properly. So now our 20 pixels of padding will not be, will actually be included into the width. Okay. So I'll go ahead and save that. We have a few things that aren't clearing properly. For example, the details section, we want to clear past the height of anything floating above it. So we can actually scroll down then to that details section here. And we can go ahead and set the details section to clear both. So that means that the details section then will no longer jump up next to this thing that's floating, and these guys will have the appropriate width, so they should appear side by side. So let's go ahead and save the code, and we shall come back into the browser and refresh. Cool, so now these guys are appearing side by side. Okay, so we solved some of our problems here. We now have, this guy has a column to left class, which is making it float left and giving it a 66.4% width versus this one, which is using a column 1 right class, which is floating to the right and has 32.6 width. And because we changed the box model to border dash box, this has the 32% or 32.6% width is including the padding here. And so is this one here, the 66.4% width is including padding. And then we have 1% margin, which adds this up to a total of 100%. Okay, and I told this details section to clear by saying clear both. Here, I got this details section to clear past the height of those elements that are floating above. Okay. You may notice that a few other things are happening that's a little bit goofy. So one thing is that the div with the ID of wood, this wood texture, it's actually only as tall as this element, which is not floating. This column 3 element is not floating, but remember whenever you have a parent element and you float children inside of it, it loses its reference for how tall to be. So now this wood, this div with the ID of wood, which has the wood texture, is collapsing. It's a parent that's collapsing because we have the floating children inside of it, right? So do you guys remember the method we used, the fix we used to stop a parent from collapsing? So I'm going to come up here into fixes, and I'm going to add that special CSS hack for fixing a collapsing parent that's called clearfix. So we'll create a class of clearfix : after, and we'll come inside and we'll say content, and we'll throw in like a little period symbol there. We'll tell this content to display block, and we will tell this guy to clear both, to clear past the height of any floating children, any floating elements above it, excuse me, and then we'll change its visibility to hidden so we don't actually see that content, and we'll set its height to 0 and its line height to 0 as well. Whoops, and we have a little typo there, we'll fix that. Okay, so I can now apply this class to any element that's collapsing. So for example, I can come in here to the div with the ID of wood, and we can add a class of clearfix to stop that guy from collapsing. Okay, so we'll go ahead and save that. We will come back to the browser and refresh. And cool, now we can see the wood textures repeating all the way below the floating children. So clearfix is coming down here and clearing past the height of the floating children, giving this parent element, which is called wood, a reference for how tall to be. Okay, let's go ahead and do the same thing for these 3 divs down here. Let's turn this into a 3-column structure. So we just did it before, so it should be pretty easy to remember how to do this time. So if I come down here into details, let's go ahead and give this first one here a class of column1left. So we'll say div ID, or excuse me, div class column1left, like that. And we'll come down to the second column and we'll give this a class of column1mid for the middle. And lastly, we'll give the last div here a class of column1right. And that should make those guys appear side by side. And we don't want the section to collapse because we have, these guys are floating children, so we're going to have the same issue we had up above with the section, or excuse me, with the div with the ID of wood was collapsing. Now we'll have the same issue where the section ID details will collapse because all of its children inside are floating. So we have to give it a reference for how tall to be by adding that clear fix into the mix. And if you don't remember quite what clear fix was for, go ahead and go back to the videos in the slide lecture to check that out. So I saved that and we can refresh. And now you can see these guys side by side, which is pretty cool. I think I'll add a little border on the right hand side here and a right hand side here just to these 2 here. So we'll go ahead and create a class for that here. I'm going to go back into the style and into the global style section, and underneath shadow here, why don't we create a class called border right, like that. And we'll say border dash right colon 1 pixel. We'll say dotted and give it a medium gray color. And we'll also add some padding on the right hand side also, so the text never goes right up against that border. And we'll say padding right 20 pixels, like that, and save. So I just want to apply this border right class to that details section down here, but only to a few of these. So I only want that border to be in the 2 central columns there. So we'll go ahead and add it to the first column inside of details, which is called column1left. We'll come in here and we'll say border right, like that, to add that style there. And we'll also go to this one called column1mid, and we'll also add border right to that one as well. And we will save. And I'll come back and refresh. And now you can see it's kind of subtle, but I created a dashed line right here on the right hand side of this column and also on the right hand side of this mid column here. So now we just have like a subtle little line there in the center. Alright, that's looking pretty great. I gotta say, I'm impressing myself, guys. I'm liking the way that's looking there. So I've already added these classes to the other pages. You can see that this has a class of column1left, this has a class of column1mid, this has a class of column1right. Here we have a 2-column structure, so this one's called column2left, and this one's called column1right, 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 and this is column2left. And here we have the 3-column structure, column1left, column1mid, and column1right. All right, and this is going to allow us to create different column structure on different pages to whichever section we like. So if I go to the sale page, this one has a class of column3 or col3 to mean that it takes up 3 columns across. And here we have column1left, column1mid, column1right. All right, this one is column3, takes up all 3 columns there. And you can see since I have a width of 100% inside of my my table here, it's just expanding as far as it can here until it runs into the edge of the section. Now on the contact page, we have a class of column 2 left and a class of column 1 right. Okay, so that's about it for this exercise. I hope that this gave you some insight into how to create page structures with multiple columns and the flexibility to write your own CSS styles, to create your own grid systems using combinations of floating, the sizing of your columns, and also techniques to fix issues like ClearFix to prevent collapsing parents, and box sizing to adjust all of the browsers to use the same box model, and also techniques like clearing so that we can clear past the height of any floating elements above. In upcoming exercises, we're going to take it a bit further, learning some advanced positioning techniques. We're going to come back and finish up the styling for the navigation, the main nav at the top of the page. Then we'll move on to learning to build some responsive designs using CSS3 media queries. So I hope you like this one, and I hope you're starting to get the hang of building your own page layouts. Feel free to check out the links below the video for some more tutorials on positioning and building page layouts. And then go ahead and move on to the next code challenge, where you'll be adding some positioning and column structure into your own website layout.